Mid-afternoon one day, while Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy were having lunch together in the dining room, Bobby came home unexpectedly. He sat down with them and over a soft drink said, "I came here first because I wanted both of you to know my plans." Mr. Kennedy's eyes shot up and he peered at his son intently. "I'm holding a press conference in the morning," he said, "to announce that I will run for the presidency. The field is wide open with Johnson out of the way, and I'm going for it." Neither parent spoke. His mother looked at him blankly, and Mr. Kennedy put his head down and stared at his food. There was an eternity of silence. Then Mrs. Kennedy got up from the table and walked around it to kiss him. She began peppering him with questions, trying to be gay and light, but both of them kept their eyes on Mr. Kennedy, who had not moved. He would not touch his lunch. Instead, he motioned to me that he wanted to be taken to his room. Bobby waited until he knew his father would be retiring for his nap, and then he came up and kissed him goodbye. "Try to understand, Dad. I think I'm doing it the right way," was all he said. On looking back to that day, I realized that no one said to Bobby that it was a wonderful decision he had made. No one congratulated him. There seemed to be a pall over all of us, and when we would see pictures of him dashing here and there on his campaign, it sent a cold wave through everyone. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'm Jess Cannell, and I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, we have an interesting reading today. We've been going through the Kennedy case by Rita Dallas. She was the personal nurse to Joseph P. Kennedy, the father in the Kennedy family, through the last 8 years of his life. And the last two episodes that we've done have been the selections from this book that were in regard to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And today we are going to get into the ones regarding Robert F. Kennedy. As you can see, the book is, a normal size book, and we are not reading all of it. She has interesting insights about many different things. And so maybe at some point we could come back and revisit the book and read it in total. But right now we are just doing a few select readings from this book to get a sense of the behind the scenes look of what was going on at Hyannisport, their family home in Massachusetts, up on the Cape, while these historic events were happening in their family's life. So today we are reading chapter 19, which came right after chapter 18. So the last reading actually leads right into this one. And we are going to do a few select portions from chapters until we get to the section about Robert's assassination. For the next 2.5 years, Robert Kennedy became the central focus of strength and hope for the family. Bobby gave of himself with extraordinary intensity and generosity. Despite his own grief and loneliness, he radiated an inner strength that I have never seen before in any other man. Bobby Kennedy has always been controversial, but I saw him as a man of enormous personal integrity and honesty. Much has been said about his unique devotion to Jacqueline Kennedy, but none of us who were close to the family at this time ever felt his actions were exaggerated or strained. Whatever he did as a natural instinct. He was there when she needed him, but he never pushed his protectiveness on her. The fact that she turned to him was enough, and to my knowledge, he never let her down. Shortly after the assassination, a television program was scheduled to be carried via worldwide satellite. I believe this was the premiere telecast via satellite, and the First Lady was offered this opportunity to acknowledge her gratitude to people around the globe for the worldwide response of deep concern at the death of her husband. She made a specific request for Bobby to appear with her, which, of course, was accepted by the producer. The First Lady chose not to broadcast from her own home, but from Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy's living room instead. The TV crew arrived, and the night before the program, Mrs. Kennedy's secretary and I had dinner with the director and the producer. They peppered me with questions about Mr. Kennedy, some of which I felt I could not answer. Apparently, they had been warned of his unstable behavior pattern, so she's talking about the father. And they suggested that I might be able to keep him away from the living room during the setup and the telecast. There was no possible way for me to agree to such a request, and I reminded them that they were using his home, and also that if the First Lady was willing to chance his being unruly, then no one else had any reason to worry about it. The next afternoon, workmen and equipment began to arrive at the house by the van loads. Technicians swarmed, shouting orders, running in and out, stretching special lines. Remote trailers sat bumper to bumper in the drive in the parking lot, and the house was so noisy that even Mr. Kennedy, who was upstairs in his private quarters, could not help hearing the commotion. He could see strange men running up and down the hall, carrying rolls of electrical wiring over their shoulders. And he knew something out of the ordinary was going on in his house. As I expected, he decided to find out what it was. He threw his leg over the side of the bed and pointed emphatically to the elevator. I could tell by the fire in his eyes that he was boiling mad, so I took it upon myself, since no one else had, to explain to him what was happening. He listened with a deep frown covering his face until I said, "I'll take you downstairs any time you want to go, Mr. Kennedy, but please don't get angry. Remember, the First Lady and Bobby want it done this way, so don't spoil it for them." They show him around what they're doing and explain all the cameras and everything, and that the program is going to be beamed all over the world by satellite. And then it says, the producer won Mr. Kennedy over completely when he said, "Your son's devotion to the space program has made this kind of televising possible, Ambassador." And with that, Mr. Kennedy waved his hand in great dignity and signaled that I could return him upstairs. That night, a short time before the show, Bobby sent word that he would like me to be downstairs during the program. Everyone in the family was very keyed up, and everyone was afraid that Jackie would faint. I left Mr. Kennedy with the backup nurse, for he was in good spirits and smiling broadly. As I left, I decided I would not go into the living room, so I picked a spot on the main stairway and sat there. I was in a position to hear the nurse if Mr. Kennedy happened to need me. And I could also see First Lady and Bobby on the couch. If she fainted, as everyone was afraid she would, I could get to her. So her medical expertise at this point are being kind of leaned on just in case something happens with Jackie. Bobby and the family were waiting for her in the hall when she came in. She looked around and her eyes got very large. Bobby did not make a dash. He simply smiled and walked easily toward her. She clung to his hand while he guided her past the rest of the family, pointing out the cables on the floor carefully, and eased her into the living room. Later, I'm skipping some of the parts where they're explaining, like, she met the producer, blah, blah, blah. When it was over, she stood up, came out into the hall, and saw me sitting on the stairway. "Mrs. Dallas, thank you for being around. Only, I'm so glad I didn't need you." She was a beautiful young woman, held in high esteem by the world. Everyone adored her in her grief. She epitomized the sorrow of every American and everyone around the world who had loved and admired her husband. I watched her go to each member of the family to thank them for their support. Finally, she grasped Bobby's hands and kissed his cheek, and my eyes filled with tears of admiration. But somehow I could not help wondering what would happen when this extraordinary woman would finally lay aside her widow's weeds and seek another life for herself. What then? I wondered. What then? We're skipping ahead to a selection from chapter 20. After the assassination, we became acutely attuned to potential dangers, and I quickly developed the nervous habit of taking secret but sweeping glances around me out of the corner of my eye. Early one afternoon, I needed to phone the pharmacist in order to go over Mr. Kennedy's supply of medicine. They're at Palm Beach at this point. They're not in Massachusetts anymore. She says, as was their custom after lunch, Mr. Kennedy was napping, and his wife had gone to her bedroom to rest. The domestic staff had settled down for their habitual afternoon break, so not wanting to disturb anyone, I decided to do my telephoning from the kitchen. I took a shortcut and used the back stairs, as Mrs. Kennedy called it, the maid's stairway. This stairway stopped at a small landing by the kitchen, and from it there were 4 or 5 steps that led in another direction, opening onto the patio. The patio was attached to the long arbored walk that led to the front door. I was being very quiet, just dialing the phone, when a cold sense of something's wrong swept over me. A moment later, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man dash across the patio. I was frozen in my tracks. He opened the door and I watched as he actually seemed to slink up the few steps of the landing. I was terrified, and call it women's intuition if you will, but I sensed danger. He spotted me in the kitchen and we both stared at each other for a moment. Then he made a dash through the house. I ran after him shouting, "Who are you? What do you want?" He stopped abruptly, turned to face me, and in a completely calm voice said, "Oh, I'm the TV repairman. I've been called to pick up a set." I knew that the televisions were always serviced ahead of our arrival, both at Palm Beach and Hyannisport, for Mr. Kennedy would not tolerate a malfunctioning set. He was a fanatic about it, for his family was constantly in the news, and he never wanted to miss a report about them. The man was lying. I knew that every set was working perfectly. There was another reason I knew he was lying. Whenever a service call had to be made, the staff was notified, for nothing was ever removed from the house. The broken appliance would be taken to a spare room and repaired on the premises. This had been enforced for security reasons when the president was alive, for with him constantly in and out of the house, every precaution was taken. There was always the danger that a bomb could be planted. I also knew all the repairmen the family used, and this man was not one of them. He was not wearing a uniform, etc. I knew he was an intruder, and even though I was terrified as we stood facing each other, perhaps my years of nurse's training had taught me to remain calm in an emergency. Still and all, I had no idea what to do. I felt very insecure since the Secret Service men had left. Our new security force was made up of local men from the police force who were doing the job on the side. I knew they were good men, but I had no idea how they would react to a crisis. With my mind flashing these thoughts, I knew I had to do something. I decided to act nonchalant. "Stay here," I said, hoping he did not notice the tremor in my voice. "I'll check and see which set needs repairing." He shrugged, and I dashed from the kitchen, ran through the hall, and threw open the front door. I looked in all directions for a guard. One had been assigned to cover the front part of the grounds, but was nowhere in sight. So I ran the length of the house and finally found him sitting in the parking lot in his car, eating a sandwich. Mrs. Kennedy did not want the men to eat in the maids' dining room, so either they had to bring their lunch or leave the premises and eat at the drugstore. If they left, that meant the house and the grounds would not be covered, so I rushed over to his car and told him what had happened. We headed back into the house, but the kitchen was empty. "He's gone," I said. "Oh, good heavens." I pointed the guard in one direction and I started in the other. He covered the downstairs quickly, and then we met back in the kitchen. He followed me as I dashed up the back stairs. Halfway up, I thought, what am I doing? He's the one who should be going first. I stood aside and motioned for him to go ahead of me. When we reached the second floor, I was frantic. Again, call it intuition, but I felt he was nearby. We turned into the main hall and saw him at the fuse box with the door of it opened. The policeman drew his gun and shouted, "Freeze!" Anne, that's Anne Gargan, the family member who is helping occasionally be a companion for Joseph Kennedy. Anne heard the commotion and came tearing out of her room. She saw the guard holding the man at gunpoint and ran back, slamming the door. I heard her calling me from behind it. Through it, I told her what had happened, and she said, "I'll call Bobby." The guard had the man handcuffed and was shoving him down the stairs, but the intruder was in no way ruffled. Bobby's reaction to Anne's call had immediate results, and within minutes, police cars surrounded the property. They arrived without sirens, so as not to alarm the household or the neighbors. They took the intruder outside, stood him in the middle of the parking lot. His ankles were then manacled, and a ring of policemen encircled him. I was told to identify the man. "Is this the man you saw entering the house?" "This is the man I saw in the house," I corrected. "Was he carrying a bag or suitcase or package of any kind?" "No." "Were his hands in his pockets?" "No, they were swinging free. When I first saw him, he was moving fast, and he was swinging both arms freely." "That's all, Mrs. Dallas, and thank you." The intruder stood, motionless, as if he were planted to the cement. I was perplexed by his remote attitude. He had accepted the arrest without any kind of reaction. He merely dropped his hands from the fuse box and voluntarily lifted them above his head. I knew that if he had been there on bona fide business, his whole attitude would have been different. Any normal citizen would first of all be upset at being arrested. He was not. He could have protested or identified himself. He could have said, "Call my boss," or "I live at such and such street." When I identified him, there was no reaction. He said absolutely nothing, to my knowledge, to the arresting officer. He was the calmest man I have ever seen, and I knew this was not right. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy napped through all this excitement. Mr. Kennedy was quite aggravated and glared at the agent as he was helped from the car, so they're back at home. I looked around and there was no evidence to indicate that things were not normal. But that evening I was leaving for my home and I asked one of the high-ranking guards about the intruder. I received a brief answer. He has connections in Dallas. My stomach turned to lead, strangely enough not in fear of my own safety, but for the aging parents who had already suffered through so much. How do you know? I asked. I've already said too much, but you were involved, so I'll stick my neck out and tell you that he let something slip. I was not tempted to pursue with further questions, but instead of going home, I went back into the house. I was heartsick. I went in and I found Mr. Kennedy in the library, sitting in his lounge chair, his good legs stretched out in front of him, hunched forward, absorbed in a television news program. Later that same week, I asked one of the local guards if he knew what had happened to the intruder. The incident had not been reported by the press, nor had any correspondents tried to contact the staff. He answered me in a strange way. I don't know, Mrs. Dallas. One day they've got him in jail. The next day he's gone. Just like that. Nobody's talking. That was the last I heard about the man. Someone had clamped on a lid and no one would be able to pry it off. This is fascinating because what she's saying, it's what we see when we see Epstein, right? Where he gets convicted of a horrific crime that for anyone else would put you behind bars, like with multiple life sentences where you'd never get out of jail. And him, he's going in for daytime release in a jail, sort of, in Florida, where he goes into an office for like 4 or 5, 6 hours a day and has access to phones and this and that. And he's like got a little ankle bracelet on and he's supposedly on house arrest and he never goes to jail. And after this, he's still convicted. And only later does he actually end up in jail. But even then, we've got these suspicious circumstances around his death. Anyway, I just think when there is the fingerprints of intelligence, it looks like this, right? A man who just comes in, is fiddling with the fuse box, has no explanation for who he is or why he's there, doesn't seem concerned or fazed by meeting Rita or by being questioned by the Secret Service, and then is just gone, is jailed, and then the next day just disappears and there's no answers. That is classic. There's something else happening. This is not a normal person who gets treated like a normal citizen. I, she says, like most every other American, still have deep questions about the assassination, and I have no information to challenge the final assumption issued by the Warren Commission, except that I have never rested easy within my soul. The events that surrounded the assassination will always plague the minds of everyone, but those of us close to the Kennedy household never witnessed a discussion regarding it. There was no open speculation, either among the domestic staff, the professional personnel, or any members of the family. There was, however, an apparent dread in everyone, a jumpy nervousness, a feeling of apprehension and unrest. Life, of course, went on. People came and went, but we lived in a different world. Interesting. Okay, well, we are going to go ahead. Here we go. We're going to keep going with selections about Bobby. We saw very little of Bobby during the first part of December, but when he did come around, I was shattered by his appearance. If ever a man suffered, it was he. Not only was he burdened by his brother's murder, but he was laboring under a hostile change of administrators. There was no love between himself and the new president, and it became apparent to everyone that President Johnson did not want a Kennedy, especially one named Robert, to remain as a member of his cabinet. President Johnson did, however, make a personal visit to Mr. Kennedy in order to express his sympathy, and the day he came proved difficult for everyone. Mr. Kennedy was always fastidious about his appearance and never received a guest unless he was groomed to the hilt. That day, not only would he not get dressed, but he would not get out of bed or change from the pajamas he had slept in. Neither would he allow us to do so much as comb his hair. President Johnson arrived and was escorted in by Mrs. Kennedy. He was very sympathetic and polite, but Mr. Kennedy would not so much as look at him. Mrs. Kennedy was thoroughly embarrassed, not only by her husband's behavior, but by his obvious snub. She tried in vain to make conversation, but it was obvious to everyone that Mr. Kennedy would have no part in it. In just a few minutes, President Johnson departed, and no sooner was he out of the house than Mr. Kennedy was ready to get up. He was quite a man, this patriarch, and even though he was lying flat on his back, his old "to hell with you" attitude was still intact. He had been like a Roman emperor that day. It was thumbs up or thumbs down. Even though he could not speak a word, he left no doubt as to how he felt. He was aware of the open rift between President Johnson and his son, and he would not feign friendliness when he was filled with such deep resentment. That's interesting. Before Christmas, Bobby had made a public decision that rocked his entire family. He picked the remote and unscaled mountain in the middle of the Canadian Yukon Territory named after his brother and announced that he intended to climb it in order to establish it as a living monument. Bobby had never done mountain climbing before, but he took on this challenge of this high, rugged, ice-covered tower with a violent ferocity and a wild-eyed, hell-bent determination. Mr. Kennedy would watch the running reports of his son's climb on television and shout, "Nah, nah," at the top of his voice. He would shake his fist at the set and scream. Or if he found a picture in the paper of Bobby in his mountain gear, he would angrily grind it into a ball and throw it across the room. He was uncontrollable. And when word came that Bobby had finally reached the top of the mountain, he screamed all the louder. Nothing anyone would say would comfort or console him. Finally, Bobby came home, and his eyes, usually so blue and brilliant, were pale in their weakness. He was an exhausted but proud man. He knew his father was angry with him, but I doubt if he was prepared for the onslaught he received. Mr. Kennedy was actually violent when he saw his son. He threw anything near him and screamed until he was hoarse, but the saddest thing of all was that he would not look at his son. Wow. Bobby had brought back a framed picture taken from the top of the mountain and had had a piece of the rock from it embedded in lucite for his father. But Mr. Kennedy would not accept it. He shouted his son out of the room. Bobby was visibly shaken. We stood outside in the hall, and he took both my hands in his. "Mrs. Dallas, why can't Dad understand? I had to do it. I had to." "I know. And he'll understand in time," I replied. "I think he's still petrified with the thought that something might have happened to you, and he probably feels you were risking your life for nothing." He went away with his head tucked deep in his shoulders, saying almost to himself, "I had to climb it. I had to." Mr. Kennedy would not give in. He would turn his face away and roar when Bobby tried to talk to him. I saw it was destroying Bobby. Every day he looked more haggard. After he had had a terribly disturbing visit with his father, he said, "Mrs. Dallas, it's useless. I might as well go home." "Wait," I urged. "Give him a chance. Don't go yet." Bobby slumped down in a chair and buried his face in his hands, and I knew something had to give. I also knew that it had to be Mr. Kennedy. I went back to his room, clicked off the intercom, and said, "I want to have a private talk with you, Mr. Kennedy." I think he knew what was coming, for he propped himself up on his elbow and glared at me. "Mr. Kennedy, I don't know why you're treating Bobby as you are, but I am very disappointed by what you're doing. I've never known you to be unfair before, but you are now." He flopped back on the bed and grumbled. I don't think anybody probably ever talked this way to Joseph Kennedy. "I don't care what you say. Bobby doesn't deserve this kind of treatment from you, of all people. Don't you realize what he was doing when he climbed the mountain? What he was saying?" He looked at me with a curious frown. "He chose the tallest peak he could find, one that was rugged and steep, that had never been conquered. And he conquered it, Mr. Kennedy. He climbed it because it was named after his brother. Kennedy Mountain towers above all the others. And what do you think his thoughts were when he got to the top? He scaled cliffs that were covered with ice, going straight up, Mr. Kennedy, and he did it to touch the clouds. Don't you realize how close he was to his brother at that moment? He was as close to heaven as his human body could get him. Can't you see him there, slashed by the wind, covered with cuts and bruises? Can't you hear him say, 'This is my brother's mountain'? Can't you hear him thinking, 'I did it, Jack, and it's all yours'? Other people are going to build monuments to your son. They'll name schools after him and libraries and highways, but Bobby was the first to give him a monument, and no one can match what he did. And all you can do is scream at him and turn your face away. I clicked on the intercom and left the room. In a few minutes, I heard him and went back in. Bobby's rock and picture had been put away in a desk drawer, and Mr. Kennedy pointed to it. Without saying a word, I took them out. "Where do you want them, Mr. Kennedy?" He pointed at the top of his television, and after I'd set them there, he motioned for me to come in. He took my hand, and in a gesture that conveyed everything, pressed it to his cheek. I knew I was about to cry, so I cuffed him lightly and said, "Oh, come on, here we are acting like a couple of sentimental Irishmen." He grinned and waved me out of the room. I found Bobby sitting in the library, glumly. "Why don't you try one more time to go talk to your father? One more time." He pulled himself up out of the chair and gave a long sigh. She talked him into it, and he raised his shoulders. "Oh, okay, Mrs. Dallas." I was at the nurse's station when he came bouncing out of his father's room. His face was aglow. "He's got my picture and rock on the television, Mrs. Dallas. My God, he understands. All of a sudden, he understands." He stopped and stared at me intently. He had the same piercing eyes as his father. They could bore right through you. "Did he tell you to put them on the television?" "Yes." "Do you know what made him change his mind about me?" "I suppose he thought it over and realized why you had to do it." "Mrs. Dallas, let's not talk about it. Everyone has a mountain he has to climb, everyone in his own way. Your father's climbed them all his life, and I think he realized what you had to do. He'll be proud of you for it, too." "Mrs. Dallas, be off with you now," I said, pretending gruffness, "and go find another mountain to climb." Bobby Kennedy never mentioned the incident to me again, but after his death, I received a picture of him from his wife, taken when he reached the top of Mount Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was unforgettable. He had the rare ability to stand in another man's shadow and be able to do so without bitterness. Although he only stood 5'10" and was the smallest of the three brothers, I never knew a man who could equal his stature. He had unique courage and loyalty. I never saw him fail to recognize and accept the responsibilities of his destiny. Not only was he there for his family, but he continued to perform for his country right through a time of intense personal tragedy. She talks about Teddy. I think we'll read a little bit of this. It says, in the mid-June of the same year, a little more than 6 months after the assassination, Teddy, who was already campaigning for his second term in the Senate, was critically injured in a plane crash. This accident not only cost the life of the pilot, but also plunged the family into new anxieties and fears. I remember the night of the crash vividly. It happened on June 19th, 1964. Teddy was scheduled to make a political speech in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he had attempted to commandeer the Caroline to fly him to it. But Captain Baird refused to take the plane up for severe fog, and weather warnings had been issued for that area. Teddy was upset and angry about the rejection, but Captain Baird remained adamant in his refusal to fly. Refusing to respect the experience of his father's pilot, Teddy chartered a plane on his own and started out. In his party was Birch Bay, the senator from Indiana. Earlier that afternoon, Captain Baird had flown Bobby into Hyannisport, and I remember when he came to the house to visit his father, he told everyone that Teddy was chartering a plane because Captain Baird would not risk flying him in the weather. No one seemed particularly disturbed about it, but that night I was to have dinner with the crew of the Caroline and met them at the Candlelight Motel. Captain Baird was quite upset over the fact that Teddy was determined to fly. "It's bad weather. This fog is really rolling in," he said. Just then, Isabel Stearns, the owner of the Candlelight, came running to our table. "Mrs. Dallas, quick, they're calling you from the big house. Ted Kennedy's been in a plane crash and they need you." At that moment, another call came through. It was Bobby for Captain Baird. He wanted to be flown to Boston immediately. He held the line while the captain checked with flight control at Hyannisport to see if the weather was clear enough to make it to Boston. He received emergency clearance, but advised Bobby he would have to go by car from Boston to Northampton, for the airport there was still closed by a fog. It's interesting, all the flying that they're all doing regularly. It's just the norm, I guess, for their family. But, for us, we wouldn't even call this many like Ubers or something, you know. But here they are just ordering up planes for this person and that person, and it seems so commonplace. Well, they learned that Teddy has been rushed to the hospital and begin to make arrangements to go to him. When Mr. Kennedy was told of the accident and assured that Teddy was basically safe, he did not show any signs of panic and seemed to take the news with a kind of calm resignation. They were all reassuring and nervous, but there was an unspoken fear in their manner. It was too soon after the president's death for them to face another tragedy, another loss. Mrs. Kennedy, always meticulous in her religious habits, made daily masses, not only for the souls of her dead sons and daughter, but for Teddy as well. There were constant prayers and private masses being said at the house by his family, and finally the news was brought to Mr. Kennedy that his son was well enough to be transferred to the New England Baptist Hospital. It was a joyous day for everyone, especially Mr. Kennedy, for with the transfer he was told he could visit his son. However, Mr. Kennedy's upcoming visit presented another problem. He had previously not been told the serious extent of the injuries that Teddy had suffered because the doctors did not want to risk a setback for Mr. Kennedy due to worrying over his son. But Teddy was lying in an orthopedic frame. And if Mr. Kennedy were not told this ahead of time, the shock of seeing Teddy that way could be severe. But they knew Mr. Kennedy would become worried and suspicious if he were kept from visiting his son after the transfer to Boston. So the decision was made to inform him fully of Teddy's condition. They knew that Mr. Kennedy would be more relieved from worry when he actually saw his son, despite the shock of seeing him in the frame. It's interesting, this accident did harm his back terribly, and I believe there were further surgeries after this point on his back, but this is part of why, even when he was in the situation at Chappaquiddick, people wondered if he could have been, because he had to wear a stiffening back brace for, I believe, like 5 years afterwards or something. It was many years after this accident, maybe constantly, but certainly after that point, he had to wear a stiff back brace to support his back. So that's interesting. Well, we're going to move on to chapter 21. Bobby Kennedy had been carrying the heaviest responsibilities after the death of his brother. He had continued on as Attorney General without break, right through the funeral. And he also had to hold the family together when Teddy's accident happened. Finally, when President Johnson eliminated the possibility of his seeking the vice presidential nominee by disqualifying all cabinet members, Bobby came to a decision and resigned his post on August 25th, 1964. It was exactly 10 months after his brother's funeral, and only 2 months after Teddy's plane crash. However, life went on, and the Kennedy drive to take their place in history could not be stopped, no matter the cost. With Bobby's resignation, speculation began that he might try to unseat Johnson. And when reporters pressed him for comment, he grinned and said, "I have no presidential ambitions, and neither does my wife, Ethelbird." When he announced that he would run for the U.S. Senate from New York, he breathed new life into the family. Bobby's decision to run for public office rekindled a flame that had all but died. Although Teddy was continuing with his campaign from the hospital, it was Bobby who lifted them up to a new and exciting crest. He was, without question, a political genius, keenly conscious of timing. 3 days after he announced that he would run, he appeared on television at the DNC in Atlantic City, and the country was swept up once again by a Kennedy. He introduced a filmed tribute to his brother, and upon its completion, he stood with his head bowed during a wild and frenzied 16-minute ovation. He had brought the Kennedys back to life, and once more they flashed before the public with all their color and magnetism. A scintillating energy took over the family. Not one of them doubted Bobby's victory. Deep thought, of course, had gone into his decision, and they knew it would be difficult to unseat the formidable incumbent, but the determination to win wiped away all thoughts of defeat. His campaign took place in New York, and Mr. Kennedy made several trips to the city in order to get a first-hand account of his son's progress. Mrs. Kennedy was also deeply involved and excited by his election. She was alive again with a fresh burst of energy and began making public appearances and giving speeches on her son's behalf. Mr. Kennedy always watched carefully when she appeared on television. He would want the volume turned to full strength so as not to miss a word. Sometimes he would shake his head and frown, but most often he was pleased with the results and would wave at her image on the screen and say, "Yeah, yeah." It was apparent that Mr. Kennedy sanctioned and approved of Bobby's decision to run. He still yelled at him and shook his fist under his nose, but it was in a different way, for he knew that in this son rested the hope and future of the Kennedy image. When we were in New York, Bobby would always arrive at the apartment very early in the morning to have breakfast with his father. And even though Mr. Kennedy was not able to make himself understood, he was still actively giving instructions and advice. Bobby never let on that his father's speech was garbled. He would prop his elbows on the table and peer intently in his eyes. He absorbed every sound. Mr. Kennedy's voice would rise in excitement and then fall into a low, confidential whisper, while Bobby listened carefully. I had often watched the president concentrate on the inflection of his father's voice. He would lean back in his chair, cocking his ear as if to pick up a clear word, or rest his elbow on one knee and cup his chin in his hand thoughtfully. The president was an imposing figure, mature and magnificently handsome, but Bobby was never imposing. His hair, unruly as a boy's, grew in stubborn profusion, and his great hooked nose overpowered his face. Lines cut deep ridges across his forehead, and the steel blue of his eyes flashed like the blade of a sword. He did not have the flair and sophistication of his older brother, but he bristled with energy and excitement. He was always tousled, and whenever I saw him dressed up, he still looked to me like a small boy wearing his first long trousers. That's funny. Robert Kennedy was sincerely devoted to the underprivileged and deprived, and would give vivid and often harrowing descriptions of living conditions that existed in the tenement districts. His voice would lift and explode. "I'll make changes, Dad," he'd say. "You know I'll make changes. Millions of people need help. My God, they need help." Mr. Kennedy would nod his head solemnly, then reach out his hand to his son. But whenever Bobby said something that did not sit well with his father, he still roared and shook his fist. One afternoon, during one of our visits, Stephen Smith, Jean's husband, came to the apartment and urged Mr. Kennedy to go with him to Bobby's campaign headquarters. I'm just going to show y'all the family tree again so that we're clear on who Stephen Smith is. So here is Joseph and Rose Kennedy, and these are their children and spouses as well. So JFK is up here with Jackie, but here's Bobby Kennedy with his wife Ethel. And then there's Jean, and then Teddy. Now, Teddy was married to Joan, but Jean was married to Stephen Smith. That's who they're talking about. And he was actually sort of a fixer for the Kennedy family. Some people said he was the bag man, like he would collect money when there was gifts or, essentially bribes being made to the family of some sort, but also that he was a fixer. So he was flown in immediately after Chappaquiddick. He took care of things for the family, and they trusted him. He was also a high up in Bobby's campaign. So Stephen Smith came to the apartment and urged Mr. Kennedy to go with him to Bobby's campaign headquarters. "Grandpa," he said, "you're really the one who started all this, and it would be a great boost to the workers if you would show up." Mr. Kennedy smiled but waved a gracious no, and despite his son-in-law's sincere invitation, he still refused. As with the president, he stood firm in the decision to remain in the background. We're told that both sons won their election, and she says, "We were in New York with Bobby, and 2 gala parties had been planned as victory celebrations. On election afternoon, I received a call from Mrs. Kennedy's secretary telling me that Mrs. Kennedy wanted to make sure that I would come to the victory party. Later, I received a call from Bobby's secretary extending a personal invitation from him to attend." So that's really nice. They did include their co-workers, and she describes the party. But I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to chapter 22 so we can get on with the reading about Bobby. I will finish up. Late in the afternoon, Bobby called and told his father that he wanted to take him out to dinner that night. We were planning to leave the Cape the next morning, but the senator wanted to share an evening with his family. Mr. Kennedy dressed with meticulous care, scrutinizing every detail of his dinner suit. He fussed and fumed until I had his black tie exactly right. He brushed his hair until it glistened, and when Bobby came for us, Mr. Kennedy received him with all the respect due a United States senator. Sitting erect and proud in his wheelchair, he bowed his head low and offered his hand in congratulations. Bobby had won, and as he bent and embraced his father, I heard him whisper in a husky voice, "We made it, Dad. We made it." We're on to chapter 22. Bobby threw himself into his role as a United States Senator with fierce concentration. There was never any speculation or discussion around the House that Bobby might give up this work to run for the presidency in 1968. There were always rumors from the press about it, but nothing was ever brought up in the family or staff. Then, mid-afternoon one day, while Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy were having lunch together in the dining room, Bobby came home unexpectedly. He sat down with them and over a soft drink said, "I came here first because I wanted both of you to know my plans." Mr. Kennedy's eyes shot up and he peered at his son intently. "I'm holding a press conference in the morning," he said, "to announce that I will run for the presidency. The field is wide open with Johnson out of the way, and I'm going for it." Neither parent spoke. His mother looked at him blankly, and Mr. Kennedy put his head down and stared at his food. There was an eternity of silence. Then Mrs. Kennedy got up from the table and walked around it to kiss him. She began peppering him with questions, trying to be gay and light, but both of them kept their eyes on Mr. Kennedy, who had not moved. He would not touch his lunch. Instead, he motioned to me that he wanted to be taken to his room. Bobby waited until he knew his father would be retiring for his nap, and then he came up and kissed him goodbye. "Try to understand, Dad. I think I'm doing it the right way," was all he said. On looking back to that day, I realized that no one said to Bobby that it was a wonderful decision he had made. No one congratulated him. There seemed to be a pall over all of us, and when we would see pictures of him dashing here and there on his campaign, it sent a cold wave through everyone. Bobby spoke to the nation the next day on television, and in a few brief words set the pace for his campaign. "I do not run for the presidency," he said, "merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, I am obliged to do all I can. I run to seek new policies to close the gaps between black and white, rich and poor, young and old, in this country and around the world." After listening to this speech, Mr. Kennedy accepted his decision to run and gave him the Caroline to use on his campaign tour as he had the president. The crew of the Caroline idolized Bobby, and they were quickly caught up in the excitement his appearances generated. His parents would watch the news together. They were caught up in the aura. Whenever possible, they would watch, and when the coverage was especially full, they would look at each other softly and smile. He preached against the Vietnam War with severe intensity, and when Mr. Kennedy would hear him lift his voice against it, he would nod his head in complete agreement. When the broadcasts were over, Mrs. Kennedy would leave after kissing her husband. "We have good reason to be proud of him, Joe," she'd often say, and Mr. Kennedy would smile warmly. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby was speaking in Indianapolis and was scheduled to appear that night at an open rally in the heart of the ghetto. Everyone urged him to cancel his engagement, but he never backed down. He refused the additional squads of bodyguards assigned to him and stood up before a hostile and potentially riotous throng of blacks. He threw away his prepared speech, grabbed the mic in his hand, and poured out his soul to the people. I've heard that this day, when he did this, was the day that forged his relationship with the black community of the time, that they already respected him, and they thought they knew that he was sincere in his friendship and kinship with Martin Luther King Jr., but also his genuine concern for the poor and for the Black community as a whole. But when he threw away the speech and spoke from his heart and gave such honor to King, that won the heart of the people who had been broken by Dr. King's death. She describes one night during the campaign, and she says it turned into an electrifying night for everyone. Even the First Lady had come over from her home to feat Bobby, and she was more excited than I had seen her for years. When Bobby called out the favorable statistics of the latest polls, she did not applaud politely as she usually did. She led them all. When he finished his reports, he grinned while the family cheered and said, "Looks like we're going to make it." The First Lady called from across the room, "Won't it be wonderful when we get back in the White House?" Ethel Kennedy had a very sharp and often brittle wit. "What do you mean we?" she said. We all know about the reports about what was happening between Bobby and Jackie during these years. And I think the closer he got to the White House, I don't know exactly how that played out, but I know that for a solid year or more in New York City, there's reports of Bobby and Jackie essentially hitting the town together and like making out in public, and that it was kept quiet because of everybody's awareness of their shared grief and just honor for the family, but that it was actually quite well known. So her being sharp in this moment has more layers to it and a total barb towards Jackie. Jacqueline Kennedy looked as if she had been struck. She flinched as though a blow had actually stung her cheek. The room was crisp in its silence. Ethel gave a careless shrug and walked away. The First Lady looked helplessly around the room, gave a shy, embarrassed smile, kissed Bobby fleetingly on the cheek, and went to her home, alone. No one offered to stop her. Bobby's campaign rushed on, building momentum and excitement both in the family and all over the country. His energy and dedication electrified the whole nation, and the atmosphere around the compound was charged with the anticipation of victory. The Kennedy comet was flashing on the horizon again, and nothing seemed to be able to prevent the inevitable reemergence of the Kennedy phenomenon on the national scene. Everything was building to the climax in California. How little they understood what that actually meant. But before he left for the coast, Bobby telephoned from Philadelphia that he was coming to visit his father. When Mr. Kennedy learned that his son was arriving, nothing would do except that we meet the plane. He was thrilled and excited that Bobby would take time to come to him at such a crucial point in his campaign. California was the big one, and the whole family was committed to helping him in it. Since his father could not actively participate, Bobby was doing the next best thing. He was coming to give his father a last-minute, first-hand report. So there was some sort of electrical problem, and Bobby ended up having to charter a different plane and like take a taxi to come and hitchhike over basically to see his dad. Like he said, literally bum a ride. But he does get to see his son, and Mr. Kennedy never took his eyes off of him. He was completely absorbed by every move, every word, every gesture. Bobby helped him get out of the car when we arrived home and wheeled him into the house. Mr. Kennedy wanted to go back to the sunroom, and once Bobby saw he was settled, he said, "I'll go find Mother and I'll be right back." It wasn't long before he returned and said to his father, "Just the three of us are having dinner tonight, Dad, alone, just us." Anne flinched and walked away. Interesting. So many times when the family was gathered around having a fun time, I would see this slender young woman go out with her dogs to run and play with them. She would bend down and hug them tightly, but I realized she was still a frightened, lonely girl at the charity of a family who had given her a job to do and a role to play, but who had never taken her into the warmth of their lives. That's an interesting observation about Anne, that she's on the inside, she's a family member, and yet she's not on the inside. She's not fully welcomed into moments like this. There was much laughter and gaiety that day between Bobby and his parents. He kept saying over and over, "Dad, I'm doing it just the way you would want me to, and I'm going to win." He hugged Mrs. Kennedy and said, "How will you feel being the mother of 2 presidents? That makes you quite a girl, doesn't it?" For a brief moment, her face froze in fear and tension, but she quickly pushed her memories aside and smiled at Bobby warmly, kissing his cheek. Nothing was going to let her spoil his day. Dinner was very festive, and Mr. Kennedy was bubbling with excitement. When the meal was finished, Bobby wheeled him to his room and kept right on talking as he got settled. Then Bobby said, "Dad, I'm leaving for California in a few days, and I'm going to fight hard." He bent over to kiss his father goodbye and added, "I'm going to win this one for you." He stood up straighter than I had ever seen him. Usually his shoulders were hunched, but as he stood before his father, he pulled himself to his full height. Mr. Kennedy held out his hand, and they said goodbye with a tight, lingering grip. Of course, she's spending time describing this final evening and this final goodbye because this is the last time they'll see their son. I can still see him walking down that long hall with his shoulders bowed. He knocked at his mother's door, and as he started in, he looked back at me, flashed a wide grin, and held up 2 fingers, his sign of victory. I never saw him again. She talks about California and how they were all glued to the television. On voting day, long before the polls closed, word came that it was apparent that Bobby had won. Mr. Kennedy gave a great sigh of relief and signaled that he was ready for bed. The big house also settled down, for they seemed to know that the battle was over. Half the war was won, but he had to capture the nomination at the Chicago convention. Yet, riding on the crest that he was, no one doubted that the victory was his. They all go to sleep. The harsh sound of the telephone jarred me awake, and I knew something was wrong. It was Mrs. Tripp. "Bobby's been shot," was all she said. "Is he all right?" "No, Rita." "He's dead?" "No." "Oh, thank God." "Rita, he won't make it." "What about Mr. Kennedy?" "He's still asleep." "Mrs. Kennedy?" "She knows." I hung up, staring at the phone. My mind was racing, full of confused thoughts, but somehow I managed to dress quickly. I rushed over to the big house and slipped in the side entrance. I went immediately to find Mrs. Tripp, and she told me how she had heard the news. Suddenly, the door flew open, and Mrs. Kennedy stood staring at her, crying, "It's Bobby! It's Bobby!" She slammed her door shut, and behind it, Mrs. Tripp could hear her cries over the television. Just then, Anne had come into the hall, ashen. "Aunt Rose, she knows?" She then told Mrs. Tripp that one of the children had telephoned during the night with the news that Bobby had been shot. Anne had been told not to awaken either parent. She had suffered through the terror and solitude. So then we learn about their day. Mrs. Kennedy went to Mass. No one had told Mr. Kennedy. When she returned from Mass, she was terribly upset. The photographers and reporters had swarmed into Hyannisport during the night and were merciless in their pursuit of her. She looked at me and said, hardly above a whisper, "I'm going to my room for a few moments before I go in to my husband." About 10 minutes later, she opened her door and was perfectly calm. For the first time since I had come on the Kennedy case, she went into her husband's room alone and closed the door after her. I went over to the nurse's station and turned off the intercom. She was not with him too long, and when she came out, she glanced at me and began weeping. "Stay with him, Mrs. Dallas, please." I went into the room. Mr. Kennedy was lying on his back, his hand covering his eyes. 2 tears moved slowly down his cheeks. And for a moment I was so overcome that I did not even notice the television was on, cruelly blaring out the news. There were no hidden tears when Bobby was shot, no stoic emotions, no curbed grief. Mrs. Kennedy paced her room restlessly. Anne wept. The maids cried. The aides, the secretary, the gardener, the chauffeur, the cook, everyone was in tears. Throughout the house, televisions were blaring at full volume. The set in Mr. Kennedy's room was kept on at his insistence, and he stared at it without blinking. No one could stay with him for very long. Anne would come in and try to say something, but would flee, sobbing. Mrs. Kennedy would slip in quietly, but the sight of her husband sitting so stiff, staring at the television, she would cover her face and run back to her room. Robert Kennedy died 25 hours after he was shot, and all that time, everyone in the house hung on a thread of hope, staring at the television while he fought to live. 6 of his children had been flown to California to join in the victory celebration. They were watching television when they saw him shot, and they too hung on with hope. His wife had been at his side when the bullets hit, and Jacqueline Kennedy, who had been in New York, had flown immediately to Los Angeles. When Ethel's grief overwhelmed her, she was put under sedation, and it was Jacqueline who remained at Bobby's side during the agonizing hours he fought to live. This woman, who had moved the world with her incredible dignity and grief when the president died, stood by Bobby and wept unashamed. And after 25 hours, it was over. He was gone. Whew. I did not realize that Jackie had been at RFK's side. Did you know that? I knew that Ethel had been tranquilized, and I knew that he had taken a while to live, but I did not realize that she stayed with Robert Kennedy. Robert Francis Kennedy had died on June 6, 1968 at 1:45 a.m. Pacific Coast time at the Los Angeles Good Samaritan Hospital. He had been 43 years old. We watched as his casket was placed aboard a presidential jet plane that would fly him to New York. His widow, his 2 eldest children, his remaining brother, and his sisters stood on the lift, and as the coffin was raised, they joined hands to make a circle around him. Jacqueline Kennedy mounted the steps to the plane alone, her head bowed. At LaGuardia, his widow and brother rode in the hearse past the thousands of people who lined the way to St. Patrick's. Inside the cathedral, his mother was waiting. The steps of the pallbearers echoed in the emptiness as the coffin was carried to its place on the catafalque. Archbishop Terence Cook blessed it, and prayers were offered. One by one, his family left their pews and came forward to kneel at the casket and kiss it. I've seen these photos with the children. It's heartbreaking. Slowly they left, and only Teddy remained. All through the long night, he knelt beside the velvet-draped coffin that held his brother's remains and prayed. That would impress you, wouldn't it, as a brother, to have 2 of your brothers gone like that? And to be a senator, to be in the public eye yourself at that moment. At dawn, the doors of the cathedral were open, and people came by tens of thousands. An honor guard stood at solemn attention over the coffin, which had now been draped with an American flag. At 9, the doors opened to admit the people who had filled Robert Kennedy's past. Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife, the vice president, cabinet members, senators from across the land, governors, celebrities, workers of all kinds. 2,000 people filled the hall. His brother stood to eulogize him in a voice unsteady and broken. Not to take away from the solemnity of the moment, but my understanding is that he asked somebody else to write this speech for him. He said, write something about love. And his speech writers, who were appalled that they would be asked to write such a speech, went ahead and did it. And that's the speech he delivered. So it was probably unsteady and broken because none of the words were his own. I mean, I'm sure I don't want to be hateful or judgmental. Grief is a tragic thing. And yet, at such a moment, it is a little beyond the pale to ask somebody else to write for you how you feel about your brother. It seems it'd be better to sit with somebody and say, I need your help. Can you help me craft some of my thoughts? Here are the things I'm thinking, and then have help. But he literally said, say something about love, and handed it off to others to write. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Kennedy had borne 9 children. Only 5 were left. And as her last son's voice filled the cathedral, Mrs. Kennedy wept behind a heavy veil. In Hyannisport, Mr. Kennedy, silent and alone, listened with his eyes closed as his last remaining son spoke about his brother. She talks about the grief of Mr. Kennedy holding a silent rosary while the final remains of his son were honored. Then they watched the train, draped in black, slowly carrying the mourners from New York to Washington. It took 8 painful hours for the train to reach Washington, and it was dark when it arrived in a dreary black rain. The cortege moved slowly past the Capitol, where Bobby had served as senator, and on past the office in the Justice Department that had been his as Attorney General. The people, drenched and weary from long hours of waiting, lined the streets and bowed their heads as Bobby passed. Slowly they crossed the bridge to Arlington, and by a flowering magnolia tree near his brother, they buried him. Ethel Kennedy clutched the flag in her arms and walked slowly to the casket. One by one, each of her children knelt beside her. Then Teddy, guiding his mother, came. When it was over, Mr. Kennedy gave a long, agonizing shudder and covered his face. I turned off the television and lowered the lights. Different people come in to talk with Mrs. Dallas about what had happened, but later, when the house was quiet, Jacqueline Kennedy came alone. She pulled up the footstool and sat by his bed, and they were silent in their thoughts. Much later, as she stooped to kiss him goodbye, she whispered, "We'll miss him, Grandpa." That's the end of our reading for today. Very heavy, very insightful, really good insights into the various relationships inside the household. We even got a look at how Anne Gargan was treated, but especially, I think, Jackie, her relationship with Bobby, her relationship with Ethel, her relationship with Grandpa Joe, as they called him. A very different Grandpa Joe than we have in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But Joseph Kennedy's grief, the sobriety with which Joe and Rose received the news from Bobby, that it wasn't all excitement. That was interesting to me, that it wasn't like Joe was like, yes, 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 let's go get him. That instead he was trying to guard Robert's life from the mountain. And then when he announced his candidacy, that they received it. There wasn't anger and shouting down, and yet there was this sense of what's going to happen to our boy, and then what did happen to their boy. Let me know what you noticed in the comments. I really enjoyed this one. It was heavy, but I enjoyed reading it with you, and I really am enjoying getting such a close look into the goings-on, both in Hyannisport and, like we saw with that intruder, the spy, I guess, some sort of intelligence worker, what was going on at Palm Beach. So you guys let me know what you appreciated in the comments. I will look forward to your comments, and I will see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.